It's also a bit of a wonder that there can be such enormous discharges. Also, some colleagues report that they felt nauseated and a little sick while using a dowsing rod. Some have even mentioned that they had to vomit, because the places are that detrimental that the body is overwhelmed. And also in written texts. There's this expert for radiesthesia, who is a legally sworn expert. She mentions that in written texts, in experts' literature, so to speak, they advise you not to douse in places that have such a constellation as it was there, because they're that detrimental, so to speak. That something like that could happen again.
Mrs. Tauss, in April of 2014, you had a near-death experience under unusual circumstances. According to what I've read, you were taken off guard by death during dowsing and thrown off course. And you've thought about it for a long time, whether you'd like to speak about your experience or not. Now you've decided to do so. I'm very grateful for that. Well, what happened exactly at the time?
Ich war als Wünschelroutengängerin in einer ganz normalen Wohnung.
I was a dowser standing in a normal apartment in order to examine the sleeping place of a married couple. I was examining charged reaction zones, because if they are detrimental, they can have a negative effect on the control of the immune system. And the couple had decided to hire me in order to check these things. When you start a dowsing session, it's important to remove all metallic items and all crystalline structures, because they can distort the original image like a mirror, or they may also project something somewhere else. In other words, we removed all these deceptions. Then, as always, I started putting the dowsing rod from my right to my left hand by holding it at a special marking for water, namely for flowing water. And at the moment I wanted to hold the rod with my right hand to make sure my starting point was clear, because it's very important not to begin at a detrimental place. And suddenly, that was it. There was a cut, and everything was off. From a medical point of view, I had a ventricular fibrillation. But nobody was able to tell me the cause of this ventricular fibrillation.
What happened externally during that time?
On the external, this means that the heart doesn't beat anymore, and the heart muscle goes through a sort of jitter. Then information isn't passed on anymore. It means that you're dead at that very moment. The heart doesn't breathe anymore. There's no pulse. There's no oxygen that can be transported further. And thank God the owners of the apartment registered that. They heard a bang and came back to the bedroom. They'd been in the room next door, and both were professionals in reanimation. They had both taken courses, the last one a year ago, so they reanimated me properly. Well, a CPR. And all of that happened from the outside.
So the couple just realized that you had fallen?
Exactly.
How did you experience this?
My experience was like that I was wondering why I was in a room I didn't know. Well, the earth opened up to me, and I looked inside it and saw colors in red and black. And inside that I saw people who looked emaciated, like grotesque masks. Ugly people I wouldn't have known from everyday life. And then I remembered something. I remembered something my father had told me. I find that quite incredible that I thought of that. He met people who had been released from the concentration camp in Mauthausen, and he was wondering about their looks, because he had never seen people like that before. People that looked so emaciated. And at that point, I was thinking, no, these people are not from a concentration camp. They're other people. And at that point, I realized something and thought, it's about dying. That's what this is all about. I'm in this room where everything is about realization. In hindsight, I'd say it was a place of awareness. And during this moment of realization, it was clear to me that if this is all about death, it's no problem for me. I thought, it's okay, but I don't want to die here. Not here, with this horrible vibe and atmosphere and those people who seemed to be unreachable. And suddenly, in hindsight, I remembered that there was a sense of relief when my husband died. And so I thought, all right, if this is about death, then I'd like to die somewhere where I can find salvation. And all of a sudden, I was in a new area, or in something like a room. It was bright and beautiful there. And there I also met my deceased husband and father. They were opposite of me. First my husband, and then my father. And both were at the peak of life, with their red cheeks, and they greeted me with joy. But at the same time, there was something like an invisible fence between me and them. It was something like water. Something you could barely see and feel. I just realized that afterwards. And I greeted them and they greeted me, beaming at me. And my father had this wise, gentle smile on his face and nodded at me. Don't worry, everything's okay. It was very heartfelt and loving. And then we were talking to each other. I don't remember what we were talking about. But while we were having a conversation, I was thinking, how strange, Dad and Harald died a long time ago. Why am I able to talk to them now? And then I was thinking, well, I don't care now. Let's just enjoy the situation, because it's pretty clear that I'm not dreaming. So while I was experiencing this, I was questioning it at the same time. Like, how could this be possible? And I tried to connect it to the real world.
People who had a near-death experience often report that if they meet their relatives and friends, they don't appear old and frail, but rather at their peak of life. Did you have a similar experience?
Yes, especially my father. He was more than 80 years old when he died. And during the near-death experience, he was at the peak of life. I'd say he was about 50 years old. At the time he was 50, I was at an age where I perceived him as quite strong. He'd probably been stronger before, but for me, as a child, he seemed very strong and healthy. And the same applied for my husband. He appeared strong and full of joy. And he was beaming. Both were beaming.
What happened after you had spoken to them? What else did you experience? Can you still remember?
Well, I experienced a number of sequences. One of them had a very deep impact on me. I'd been on a holiday to Greece with my son, who was 13 years old at the time. He was reading old Greek mythology at the time. And there was this moment when we had a chat and I explained to him the psychological and spiritual significance of these Greek legends. And at that moment I thought, but actually, I haven't really read them. I just know what other people have told me about them and what the summaries I've read say. My son is better informed than I am. And nevertheless, I thought, sometimes there are moments when you've got access to knowledge that's bigger than your own, and I want to stay there. I think we spent a whole day, at least felt like a whole day. We spent a whole day dealing with this topic, and it was very enriching. And I almost had the feeling as if Zeus himself was sharing all this knowledge with me. In hindsight, it's just a feeling or an interpretation.
Are there any other interpretations that you can remember?
Yes. I used to be a psychiatrist and was specialized in people who had made traumatic experiences. And in this coma, I had a conversation with one of my brothers, who'd also gone through a near-death experience and a rough patch in life. I told him, come on, you should deal with this problem, otherwise you won't progress in life. Let me treat you. And he didn't want to, because as you know, it can be harder to talk to somebody about something if you know them well. So it was understandable, but I kept bugging him that long until he agreed. And I did an EMDR treatment with him, which is a psychotherapeutic technique. And it worked really well. And after coming back to real life, I told him about this. And he said that while all these things were happening to me, he decided to go through all the stations that had led to the drama he'd felt trapped in and solve them.
Als das mit mir passiert ist, das durchgegangen ist und aufgelöst hat.
So in retrospect, it felt like, wow, this was highly effective. Well, in one way or another.
Was there some sort of decision that urged you to do it?
Oh, yes.
Or a decision that made you want to go back into your own body?
Ah, I see. No, that didn't happen. I just chose death. Well, in that place of awareness. It was pretty clear to me that it was about death, and I decided to do it. But there was never something like being sent back or being rejected. But it was, well, I'd just say I met God himself personally. I'd say that was the hardest part of all for me. Because I'm not religious or devout in the Christian sense. I know there are powers and energies that effectuate something, and that there's something on the spiritual level that influences me, and vice versa. That's quite clear to me. But God himself? I can't even tell where this is coming from. I've always had inhibitions or problems to take it like that. And then there was this situation where I'd say we stood face to face to each other. But I didn't perceive a being, but more something like an energetic light. Something like a cloud. And when I realized that this was God or the source of life, I thought, gosh, he really does exist. What am I gonna do now? There was this realization that came over me, and I was shocked about this situation, because I thought, now I've got to change my whole life. I felt pretty much out of control of my own life. But he did, I don't know if he, I just thought of a situation. He didn't send me back directly. But during the conversation with my deceased husband, there was this situation that reminded me of a cartoon or whatever. like Scrooge McDuck, who receives a kick in his bum and whee! I landed back on Earth and was alive again. Well, it was like a push, a swing that transported me back. And my husband was the one who had the honorable duty to do that. I'd describe it like that. But it wasn't a rejection. It was just part of this flow, this event.
So you hadn't been religious before? Rather, you'd been more like an atheist?
Well, I was always wondering about things, especially as a child, about how things work. Because people would tell you many different things. I grew up in the countryside of southern Styria and enjoyed going to funerals. It was like an adventure for me, the things that happened there and how death worked. I was very interested in it. I regretted that I wouldn't experience death because then I'd be dead. But this is a little different. I don't think that I was religious. And today it's also difficult for me. I haven't found the right approach for me yet.
So you had the feeling that you had to change completely?
Yes.
To what extent? What did you think about?
I thought I had to become religious. Thought I had to believe in all those things that had been told to me in Christianity. And of course, I know that you can't take everything literally. Well, all those stories have got more of a symbolic character to me. But if I accept them, it would be really a fresh start for me.
Das wäre ein Neuanfang für mich.
Partially, it happens automatically because of my experience. And then ratio hits me and tells me, what are you doing here? This is nonsense. What's going on here? Well, I'm still feeling torn in this respect. Ambivalent, but I think I'm allowed to. I've still got some time.
So you associated this encounter with God definitively with the Christian belief system?
No. Well, in retrospect, yes. But when I experienced it, no. It didn't have anything to do with religion, but it went far beyond that. Well, it was the energy of every life, no matter if it was a stone, a human, or Earth itself as a being. Something along those lines.
So religion would be a crutch to get closer to this experience?
Yes, it's an attempt to give the unspeakable a name and to offer people a bit of guidance in life. Something along those lines. Well, it's always a bit clumsy if you try that.
Let's go back to changing one's life. Did this trigger other thoughts too, such as, I should live a more responsible or an even more conscious life?
No. I'd always been very interested and had made an effort to be and stay conscious of life.
Konnte vorher und kann auch jetzt mein Leben den
I was always able to value my situation, that I live in Europe, that I live in peace, that I'm socially secured. I was always able to value that. So that wasn't anything new to me. It was more about the internal side with me. Well, there was one change for sure. I woke up from my coma with a portion of humor, so to speak. It's like resurrection for me. Because I can just laugh at topics and conflicts that happen in everyday life. Well, of course they still keep me busy and stress me, but it's all relativized now. They don't bother me that much anymore. That's the main change for me.
So you just collapsed while dowsing in this apartment, and then you were sent to hospital. What were the physical results of this event?
I think there were two aspects. One of them was the fact that the heart didn't beat anymore. At that point, blood isn't transported anymore, and the blood thickens. Due to the CPR, several ribs were broken. The blood vessel was torn, which injured the lung internally, meaning the lung was pretty much overflown with blood. I think it was a big challenge for the doctors, for the emergency team, because they couldn't just inject a blood clotting medication, because it would have bled to death internally if it had bled even more. At the same time, even two thromboses developed, and one of them went through the heart. This is called spontaneous recanalization. It pressed itself through, in what way ever. A thrombosis developed in the right arm. And after a while, no blood could pass through it anymore. And this started at the limbs, which weren't provided with oxygen anymore. I think this was only visible in hospital. And this emergency team, these two people, must have been at the apartment within 10 minutes. So that worked really well. And they fought for me. I think they only took a break after 20 minutes and stopped. But altogether, it actually took 45 minutes until the heart started beating again. I think they had to use the defibrillator 3 or 4 times, which is a huge strain to the human organism. I was very lucky this didn't cause more damage. And in hospital, they found out that the arm had turned black, which is hard to recognize when somebody is in a coma. Because when you're in a coma, the skin color looks different.
The coma was artificially supported?
It was artificially supported, yes. And I was cold as well. I was cooled down so I wouldn't waste too much oxygen. At least that's what I think happened. And by the time they realized there was a black coloration caused by thrombosis, it was already the next morning. I think it had already started at 7 p.m. And they only realized the next morning. For God's sake! This is very critical, they said. But what would they do with me? In the hospital I was in, they didn't have a vascular surgery ward. And they had to transfer me. If they didn't manage to clean my blood vessels, I would die from poisoning. Or the other option would have been to amputate the arm if nothing else was possible. Well, it simply turned necrotic. Well, it started to. So they took the risk to transfer me to the other hospital, and there they even had a swinging bed. They strapped you into the bed, and at least that's what I was told, because I don't have any memory or conscious experience of that. Then they tilt the bed so the blood in your lungs flows from one side to the other. At that point, the upper alveoli can breathe, and then the bed tilts to the other side. At least that's how I imagine it. If this assumption is correct, I'm not so certain. By doing that, they tried to clean the bloodstreams, but it was already too late. So all they could do was to amputate the arm. Well, I didn't really experience this consciously. But fortunately, it turned out that way, because they wouldn't have transferred me to this hospital. And there I was able to survive thanks to the swimming bed. What they did was they pumped pure oxygen into the lungs, but nothing got there. So I was always provided with too little oxygen. It's even more surprising how little the damage is, because for a long period of time, I couldn't breathe by myself. And if you look at me now, I'm quite okay.
What was waking up like? How did you experience that?
Well, I'd say waking up was wonderful.
Wunderbar, sage ich jetzt mal.
I was lying in hospital, and all of a sudden I felt somebody stroking my left arm. And I heard a voice. Elisabeth, wake up! Elisabeth, wake up! And I was thinking, Christian? Why does he tell me to wake up? I'm not sleeping. You know, I'd been busy. I'd been on several excursions. It had been adventurous. And I'd been really busy with various things. And above all, I'd been able to do everything so easily.
So you'd been in the middle of a near-death experience?
Yes, I'd been in the middle of it all. And then I suddenly felt somebody stroking my arm. And I heard somebody's voice, and I was thinking, Christian, why is he telling me to wake up? And if I'm sleeping, what is he doing in my bedroom? Well, there was this connection, and I'm still fascinated by that even today. It hit me right away. What is he doing in my bedroom? He's not supposed to be there. And he was the one who had to fulfill this difficult task and tell me what had happened. And after waking up, the first thing I checked was if it was really true that my arm had been amputated. Well, if it was really gone. Was it true? I hadn't experienced it, but somehow I still knew about it. And there was this huge bandage, and I thought, yes, okay, it's true. You know, there was this recognition. Yes, it's true. Of course it was sad. I thought by myself, let's see how this is going to turn out. But it wasn't shocking. I'd say it was a bit as if a part of my soul had already experienced it. It wasn't that horrifying. For me, the whole situation wasn't that horrible. Even then, when I was lying in hospital, or when I began to realize what had happened, at that point and during that situation, I hadn't even thought of my son because we had just talked to each other. He was fine. He was 13 years old. The father had already died as well. It wasn't an easy situation, but my family and friends took over and handled everything. They really made sure I'd get the opportunity to recover in hospital.
Im Krankenhaus die Gelegenheit hatte, mich zu erholen.
I was shocked though when my friend told me, "You're in hospital because you had a heart attack." When I heard that, I thought, a heart attack? I don't believe that. It was like telling me I had green hair. Well, it was really like that. I couldn't really make anything of it. And an ECG creates another image depending on whether you've had a heart attack or a ventricular fibrillation.
What was it like when you woke up in your own body again? How did you deal with all those experiences? Were you aware straight away that you'd had a near-death experience? Did you know this term?
Yes, I was aware of it. I didn't think of the term, but I was certain that I had experienced something like that, and nobody questioned it either. People in my surroundings had heard of it as well. Well, I was woken up very abruptly because I was in the middle of working. And I had... At the beginning, I wasn't able to speak because of all those devices. I don't even know how long everything took. Well, I did get some time to sober up and wake up again, so to speak. But I was in intensive care. And I remembered a motorcyclist I had perceived during my coma. He was here and suddenly he disappeared, and then he came back and disappeared again, and then he came back. And at that point I thought, look, he's got a friend in intensive care and he comes here to stay overnight. During the day, he drives around on his motorbike and he returns in the evenings. Surely it's also a way of doing things. At least that was my interpretation. But later on I heard that he had been gravely injured and that they had to reanimate him several times, and in the end he still died. So you see, I experienced a lot, also with other patients. It was as if I had been connected with them on a mental level.
How did you get the idea to connect the ventricular fibrillation with dowsing?
When I became a bit more mobile in hospital, I was released from intensive care and put into intensive monitoring. Then came a time when I was able to lift myself up a bit and look at the rest of my body lying on the bed. And it was then when I noticed a huge laceration on my shin. And I thought, wow, I don't even remember that I'd fallen and hurt myself. So I asked the nurse, was this caused by the defibrillation? Yes, she answered. I think they didn't even take my question seriously. But this bothered me. It was like, when you look at a tree that was hit by lightning, it usually gets a tear that turns into a bruise and overgrows. And that is what it looked like. And at that moment, it was pretty clear to me. I see, it must have come to an energetic discharge here. At that moment, I touched the dowsing rod with both hands. The endogenous field or electrical field must have closed itself. And when I thought of this possibility, it was pretty clear to me that this was how it had happened. Later on, I also talked to electricians and biologists. But when I asked doctors, it wasn't that helpful to me. They didn't really have much time to deal with my concerns.
As far as I'm aware, it's not even known by the community of radiesthecians that these things can happen.
It's also a bit of a wonder that there can be such enormous discharges. Also, some colleagues report that they felt nauseated and a little sick while using a dowsing rod. Some have even mentioned that they had to vomit because the places are that detrimental that the body is overwhelmed. And also in written texts. There's this expert for radiesthesia, who is a legally sworn expert. She mentions that in written texts, in experts' literature, so to speak, they advise you not to douse in places that have such a constellation as it was there, because they're that detrimental, so to speak. That something like that could happen again. I don't think it would, because it came to a discharge. Well, I think there were at least 4 or 5 zones that met exactly at the point I wanted to start at. And so it came to a build-up, an amplification. And it's a bit similar to, you can compare it to, well, the example isn't the best, but it's just an image. If you've got the sun, and take a magnifying glass and point the magnifying glass towards the sun, you'll create a hot spot you can even make fire with. So something under inverted commas harmless, like the sun, or let's say a harmless constellation, can be that amplified by a convex layer of glass that it starts to burn. And so if several zones come together, it's pretty clear to me that it can come to a discharge, especially because I had this scar, which was significant for me.
May I quote you? I experienced healing and transformation because of a brother death. Has death become a brother to you? Is it part of normal life? What's your opinion of death today?
Yes, it was very touching what had happened to me.
Der Tod hat.
Well, first, death has got a dissolving effect. And so far as we stop to breathe, and that we, as humans, leave our body. However, at the same time, there is a form of death where something new develops. And I made the experience that this coma and this dying process was something like a resurrection where I was allowed to take my body with me. That's something I should really include. And my body was healed. In other words, I experienced a healing of physical complaints. I always used to have several allergies. They've completely disappeared. I don't suffer from them anymore, unless I behave like a wild boar when I eat. But that would be my own fault then. And I was free from all the mental baggage that everybody carries around with them. I woke up from my coma without any of that baggage. That's why dying's got a different character. When I died and observed death from my own experience, it was like a liberation. And there was this lightness I was moving around with.
Or I thought of it, and it was implemented.
Isn't that a brilliant story? And all those physical things make everything hard, all the material things. But on the other side, I do enjoy that I'm here, that I'm able to experience all the things that I'm experiencing now.
Have you become more relaxed?
Yes, a lot, in many regards. Although that doesn't mean that I'm calm all the time. I can get quite angry too.
How has this experience affected your life in the long run, such as your occupational activities or your relationship to other people?
Well, in week 4, after waking up from my coma, I talked to one of my brothers who had taken care of me and who had made sure my son was being looked after. And told him, Andreas, you need to get me out of here. I've got to work. You know, I was self-employed and I knew how much money I had in my bank account. So I couldn't just stay in hospital for months. It just wasn't possible. And parts of my thoughts went straight back to everyday life and how it could be organized. But at the same time, on the one hand, I fell asleep when I was listening to somebody, and that while I was in a seated position. And on the other hand, I was so weak and tired when I was sitting that I just fell to the side. I was in such a bad physical condition, I can't even explain it. And it took me a long time to recover. I almost spent 3 months in hospital, and it took me at least 2 years to recover more or less reasonably. In other words, to be able to walk longer distances, to hoover. I can't tell you how exhausting hoovering is. Hoovering was disastrous. I was just covered in sweat. Now hoovering isn't a problem at all. But all those physical activities were very hard, and also mentally. I've got a bad memory, so sometimes I don't remember what people have told me, and I might ask them curiously, "Tell me, what is this?" But that's pretty harmless compared to my previous state. Job-wise, other people realized more than I did that I wouldn't be able to work again the same way as before. I wouldn't be able to due to my lacking memory performance. And relationship-wise, that was a huge gift. Because all the people I knew, no matter how close we'd been. Well, with the ones that were close to me, like my siblings and close friends, it was obvious that they'd carry and support me. But even people who were not close were full of care and love. It was a totally new aspect in life for me, because I felt a kind of love that I hadn't felt before. It was a love towards myself, but also a fundamental love towards people, animals, but also trees, plants, beings, towards everything.
Would you relate this to your encounter with the light?
Well, I wouldn't be able to name the cause of it. Well, I can't really tell at the moment. It's simply that the feeling of love has been a lot clearer ever since. And I've also received clearly more love. Well, I had encounters while going shopping that were astonishing. For example, even with complete strangers, where we just smiled at each other and were surprised at what was happening during those encounters. That's something that's really changed a lot. I've also made interesting experiences with marginal groups, because suddenly I was one of them. I'm disabled now. Yes, I'm one of the disabled people. I used to live above a bakery and went shopping there quite regularly. And there used to be those two men. I'm just telling you this because it's so funny. Those men were regular customers and used to drink a few pints of beer in the course of a day. And when they saw me for the first time, they were shocked, which is understandable. If you'd known me before and suddenly there was a part missing, it would cause a shock. And they were talking amongst each other. Jesus! She used to be such a beautiful woman. It sounded as if this was over now. This was very amusing. But I also experienced a few touching moments. I was already released from hospital. It was at the very beginning, shortly after the release. At that time, I didn't go straight home and take care of my son. This was done by a friend of mine who was staying in our apartment for 7 months. She was living with him, so I had time to recover. I was living at my brother's and my mother's for a while. She was still alive at the time. So I went to the main square of Graz and got off the tram, and I thought, it was June, and I thought to get off the tram and walk for a bit, because it was such a nice day. And during this walk, everything was touching. It was the first time I was outside after my release, and I saw the sycamore tree. I was deeply touched. I'm still tearing up today. It's remarkable how powerful a tree can be. And what's behind this power? I can just say it was touching. And I think at that point something opened up in me, and I would call it healing. It was like feeling something deeper in people or beings that surround us. Even if I can't see it, I can still feel it. And so I was walking along Herrengasse, the main shopping street in Graz, and there was a beggar standing in front of the church. He stared at me. I used to give him some change regularly, so he was looking at me. He was horrified. And all of a sudden, he bowed to me and said, "I'm so sorry." It was unbelievable. We didn't really know each other. But this was an encounter that hadn't been possible before. Well, and so far I've had beautiful encounters with people, and it's really opened up something in me.
geöffnet worden.
You've also tried to process your experiences from an ideological standpoint and classify them. You've drawn connections to the Book of the Dead by the ancient Egyptians and also to legends of the Mayans. Which link can you see here?
Well, the image of Brother Death is definitely a Mayan tradition. There you've got Brother Death and Sister Death. Black and white chemie. It's basically one being split into two.
Aufgeteilt in zwei Wesen, sage ich jetzt mal.
Brother Death is the one who dissolves, but not just in the respect of death. He also supports us to dissolve mental armor, so we can end those hardenings and incrustations. And Sister Death is explained in a way that if a person dies, his or her soul leaves the body.
Den Körper verlässt.
And simply put, the soul is treated and healed. That's my experience. And then the person is reborn through the kingdom of death and rebuilds the body, the cells and the being as such. And that's the sister's job, the white chemie. Well, that's a very brief summary of Mayan tradition. And in the ancient Egyptian mythology, there is the faith in resurrection and rebirth. Here the pharaoh goes through this every night oriented on the Nile, because the sun rises in the east, and he goes with the sun because he represents the sun. And at night he travels with the carriage through the kingdom of death and is assessed within 12 hours. There he meets the beings of death in the kingdom of death. And if he passes all the tests, they also weigh his heart and check whether he did enough good deeds. Well, if he passes these tests, he's allowed to resurrect the next day. I think parts of this mythology are quite appropriate for my experience. And oftentimes you can see carvings of lotus flowers and papyrus at the entrances of graves, which are a symbol for a new beginning. In other words, the plants, the flowers, are a new beginning, so to speak. So when the deceased is brought to the burial chamber, he or she passes these plants, namely papyrus and lotus. And thus is provided or confronted with a new beginning.
So, death is part of a bigger cycle?
Death is, yes. Or it also leads to a proper new beginning.
Are you planning to work with a dowsing rod again?
I'd like to, because this energetic field, or these energetic fields that can be perceived, also have healing aspects. And many healing areas, beautiful spots. And the detrimental ones are like day and light, light and shadow. And if something is detrimental, which depends on the surroundings, you can't say that a water vein is generally something evil. The opposite is the case. If you've got a water vein in your apartment, you're lucky, because it revives and cleanses it from an energetic standpoint. Anyway, I'd like to do dowsing again, but I don't know when yet. I can imagine doing it again if I felt more secure and stable. But I probably wouldn't examine sleeping places anymore.
Mrs. Tauss, thank you very much for your openness. I wish you all the best, and thank you very much for this interview.